My name is Eve Tuck, and I am Unanga from St. Paul Island in Alaska, and my family and I are moving to Toronto in a few weeks. I am reading the section called The School Experience, which is on pages 71 to 77. The School Experience. Education, the children's work, was merely memory work. As educational institutions, the residential schools were failures and regularly judged as such. In 1923, former Regina Industrial School principal R.B. Heron delivered a paper to a meeting of the Regina Presbytery of the Presbyterian Church that was highly critical of the residential school system. He said that parents generally were anxious to have their children educated, but they complained that their children, quote, are not kept regularly in the classroom, that they are kept out at work that produces revenue for the school, and that when they return to the reserves, they have not enough education to enable to transact ordinary business, scarcely enough to enable them to write a legible letter. The school's success rates did not improve. From 1940 to 41 to 1959 to 60, 41.3% of each year's residential school grade 1 enrollment was not promoted to grade 2. Just over half of those who were in grade 2 would get to grade 6. Many principals and teachers had low expectations of their students. Wickemongwikong, Ontario, principal R. Bodwin wrote in 1883, "What we may responsibly expect from the generality of children is certainly not to make great scholars of them. Good and moral as they may be, they lack great mental capacity. He did not think it wise to expect them to, quote, be equal in every respect to their white brethren," end quote. In preparing a 1928 report on the Anglican school at Onion Lake, a Saskatchewan government school inspector expressed his belief that, quote, in arithmetic, abstract ideas develop slowly in the Indian child. Some thought that it was a risky matter to give students too much education. Mount Elgin principal S.R. McVitie wrote in 1928 that, quote, classroom work is an important part of our training, but not by any means the most important. He added, in the case of the Indian, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Much of what went on in the classroom was simply repetitious drill. A 1915 report on the Roman Catholic school on the blood reserve in Alberta noted the children's work was merely memory work and did not appear to be developing any deductive power, altogether too parrot-like and lacking expression. A 1923 inspector's report from Grayson, Saskatchewan school suggests that there has been little change. The teaching as I saw it today was merely a question of memorizing and repeating a mass of, to the children, meaningless facts. The classrooms were often severely overcrowded. At the Capel School in 1911, Sister McGurk had 75 girls in her junior classroom. The inspector of Roman Catholic schools reported to Ottawa that this was an almost impossible situation. In 1915, 2 teachers were responsible for 120 students at the Kokalitsa Institute in Chilliwack, British Columbia. In 1928, there were 60 students in the junior classroom at the Alberni, British Columbia School. The Indian Affairs Schools branch maintained that the principals and the staff were appointed by the church authorities, subject to the approval of the department as to qualifications. In reality, the churches hired staff and the government then automatically approved their selections. The churches placed a greater priority on religious commitment than on teaching ability. Because the pay was so low, many of the teachers lacked any qualification to teach. In 1908, Indian Affairs Inspector F.H. Paget reported that at the Battleford School, frequent changes in the staff at this school had not been to its advantage. The problem lay not with the principal, but with the fact that, quote, more profitable employment is available in the district, and, furthermore, the salaries are not as high as are paid in other public institutions. When a British Columbia Indian agent recommended that schools be required to hire only qualified staff, he was told by his superior, British Columbia Indian Superintendent A.V. Vowell, that such a requirement would result in the churches applying for larger grants. And, as Vowell understood it, Indian Affairs is not at present disposed to entertain requests for the increased grants to Indian boarding and industrial schools. In 1955, 23% of the 241 teachers in residential schools directly employed by Indian Affairs had no teacher's certificate. In 1961, Indian Affairs reported that it was still paying its teachers less than they could make in provincial schools. As a result, there are about the same number of unqualified teachers, some 140, in federal schools, residential and non-residential now, as in 10 years ago. In the minds of some principals, religious training was the most valuable training that the schools provided. In 1903, Brandon, Manitoba principal T. Ferrier wrote that while it is very important that the Indian child should be educated, it is of more importance that he should build up a good, clean character. Such a heavy emphasis was required, in Ferrier's opinion, to counteract the evil tendencies of the Indian nature. Louise Moyne recalled that the religious instruction and observation were a constant part of life at the Qu'Appelle School in the early 20th century. From the time that we got out of bed at the sound of the bell, we went down on our knees to pray. After we had washed and dressed, we headed to the chapel to attend Low Mass, which was always held at 7 a.m. The staff handbook for the Presbyterian school in Kenora in the 1940s stated that it was expected that, upon leaving the school, most students would, quote, return to Indian reserves from which they had come. Given this future, staff members were told that the best preparation we can give them to teach them is the Christian way of life. Not surprisingly, many of those who succeeded academically followed careers in the church. Coquilitza graduate Peter Kelly became a Methodist church minister. Emmanuel College graduate Edward Akinow became an Anglican minister. Others worked for government or taught school. Qu'Appelle graduate Daniel Kennedy became an interpreter and general assistant for the Assiniboine Indian Agency. Joseph Dion, a graduate of the Onion Lake School, taught school for many years in Saskatchewan. Still others pursued business and professional careers. After attending the Mohawk Institute, Beverly Johnson went to Helmut College in London, Ontario, where he excelled at sports and drama. He then went to work for the New York Life Insurance Company in Pennsylvania. A graduate of the Mohawk Institute, N. E. Lickers, was called to the bar in 1938 and was described by the Brantford Expositor as the, quote, first Ontario Indian lawyer. Despite these successes, little encouragement generally was offered to students who wished to pursue further education. Oliver Martin, who was raised on the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario and went on to become an Ontario magistrate, recalled being told by Indian Affairs Deputy Minister Duncan Campbell Scott that it's no use sending you Indians to school. You just go back to the reserve anyway. For many students, classroom life was foreign and traumatic. David Charlson said that he found the regimentation at the Christie, British Columbia school so disturbing that he, quote, never wanted to learn, so I just jumped into my shell. I took kindergarten twice because of what happened to me. I didn't want to learn. At the Birtle School in Manitoba, Isabel Whitford said she had a hard time adjusting to the new language and the classroom discipline. Every time I couldn't get an answer, she would pull my ears and shake my head. Betsy Olson described classwork at the Prince Albert, Saskatchewan school as torment, in which her spelling was always 30-40. It was way down. And when we did spelling, sometimes I freeze. I couldn't move. I just scribbled because I couldn't move my hand. Leona Agua never felt comfortable in the classroom at the Spanish Ontario school. For much of her time in school, she was frightened or intimidated. I'd hear my name, but I never got to answer. I stood up, never got to answer what they were saying when they sat me down, and I'd get a good slap after. After you leave there for not being nice in school. Since the 1920s, Indian Affairs had required residential schools to adopt provincial curricula. The department had also asked provincial governments to have their school inspectors inspect Indian Affairs schools. The wisdom of this practice had been questioned during the hearings of the Special Joint Committee of the Senate and House of Commons inquiry into the Indian Act in the 1940s. Andrew Moore, a secondary school inspector for the province of Manitoba, told the committee members that Indian Affairs took full responsibility for all aspects of First Nations education, including curriculum. Provincial education departments, including the one he worked for, were not organized or not interested in Indian schools. In 1963, D.W. Hepburn, the former principal of the federal school in Inuvik, published an article with the ominous headline, "Northern Education, Facade for Failure." He argued that the education being provided in the new federal schools was hopelessly inadequate. The reasons for this failure are clear. The aims of education set forth by the department are thoroughly confused. The curriculum is inappropriate, and many current practices of the system are not only ill-conceived, but actually harmful. Although 60% of the students at Inuvik School were in the first 3 grades, few teachers had any background in primary education, and almost none had any special training in Native education, and will receive none from the department. The schools were producing individuals who lack not only the skills required for most permanent wage employment, but also those necessary for the traditional economy. The decision to leave curriculum to provincial education departments meant that Aboriginal students were subjected to an education that demeaned their history, ignored their current situation, and did not even recognize them or their families as citizens. This was one of the reasons for the growing Aboriginal hostility to the Indian Affairs integration policy. An examination of the treatment of Aboriginal people in provincially approved textbooks reveals a serious and deep-rooted problem. In response to a 1956 recommendation that textbooks be developed that were relevant to Aboriginal students, Indian Affairs official R.F. Davey commented, the preparation of school texts is an extremely difficult matter. It was his opinion that there are other needs which can be met more easily and should be undertaken first. In the following years, assessments of public school textbooks showed that they continue to perpetuate racist stereotypes of Aboriginal people. A 1968 survey pointed out that in some books, the word squaw was being used to describe Aboriginal women, and the word redskins used to describe Aboriginal people. Students also noted that the curriculum belittled their ancestry. Mary Korcheny said that the only mandate was to Christianize and civilize, and it's written in black and white, and every single day we were reminded. Lorna Cochrane could never forget an illustration in a social studies text. There was a picture of 2 Jesuits laying in the snow. They were murdered by these 2, quote, savages, and they had what we called a blood-curdling look on their faces. That's how I remember the picture. When the curriculum was not racist, it was bewildering and alienating. Many students could not identify with the content of classroom materials. For instance, Lillian Ilias remembers that when I looked at Dick and Jane, I thought Dick and Jane were in heaven when I saw all the green grass. That's how much I knew about Dick and Jane. Some students say that the limits of the education that they received in the residential school became apparent when they were integrated into the public school system. Many said that there was no expectation that they would succeed. Walter Jones never forgot the answer that a fellow student at the Alberni, British Columbia School was given when he was asked if he would be able to go to grade 12. That supervisor said, "You don't need to go that far." He says, "Your people are never going to get an education to be a professional worker, and it doesn't matter what lawyer or doctor or electrician or anything that a person has to go to school for." Some northern schools developed reputations for academic success. Grandland College at Fort Smith was established originally to recruit young people for the Catholic ministry. A new principal, Jean Pocat, decided to focus on providing young men and women with leadership training. The school became known as a leadership factory, producing numerous future government leaders for the North. Students who attended the Churchill Vocational Center spoke about how they were taught by open-minded teachers who were willing to expose them to the social and political changes taking place across the world in the 1960s. John Amagolek wrote that at the Churchill Vocational Center we had excellent teachers. To this day we still talk about them. They treated us as ordinary people. We had never experienced this kind of attitude before, and it was, in a way, liberating to be with new teachers that treated you as their equal. David Similiak spoke of how his time at residential school gave him a series of new opportunities. He fondly remembers excelling at math and spelling competitions and traveling to Montreal for Expo 67. Specific teachers were remembered with gratitude. When Roddy Soucy lived in residence, he attended a local public school. He credited his high school principal at the Ponoka, Alberta public school for pushing him to succeed. Martha Loon said that at the Poplar Hill, Ontario school in the 1980s, there were staff members who befriended and helped her and her siblings. There was one staff member to whom she could go to tell all of her problems. I could say anything to her, and we'd go for walks sometimes. So I could tell her anything, and she wouldn't. She wouldn't say anything to other staff members about it. So, in a way, that's, gave me a chance to express my frustrations and the things that I didn't like. Other students were able to concentrate on their studies. Frederick Ernest Coe said that at Stringer Hall and Inuvik, he devoted all of his energies to his schoolwork. You kind of develop a protective mechanism on the shell that you didn't rat on anybody. You kind of behave. You followed orders and things would go smooth. Madeline Diane Stout succeeded academically at the Blue Quill School, but she did not credit the school for her success. It's not residential school that made me a good student. The fundamental values and a good example I had before I went to residential school by my grandfather and my parents and all the old people on the reserve where I grew up are the ones who made me a good student. Kagasagun.